Listen to Robert McDermott, who is also very well known in our community, although he's a great professor at CIIS. Yeah? And I should not say although, because we are very close friends, and not only on a personal level, but also on the level of the two institutions, CIIS and Rudolf Steiner College in San Francisco. Probably Robert McDermott will open the horizon to other culture and great people who are also very much involved in bringing that compassion and forces of forgiveness in our today world. Yeah? And as he used to say, Rudolf Steiner is unique, but not alone. Yeah? And so we will see what he will bring to us this morning. And we should be done with half an hour of conversation about, those themes, and see what we have in our heart to go away at 1 o'clock. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Great to see many of you again. Some of you are new, but many of you I recognize over these last several years, and it's great to see you all again. I guess this is the second or the third time that we've had sort of a public or announced series of lectures. Usually I do it with Irene. We did Teilhard and Steiner and Aurobindo and Steiner, and today we're doing
violence.
Sorry?
The first one, sacred violence.
Yes, sacred violence. So today we're doing forgiveness, and I'm happy to be teamed with my dear friend Brian. And we did sort of send some comparisons of what we would do. I thought Brian would do much more of the planets and old Saturn and old Sun. I said, I remember it all if I have to refer to it, etc. Last time he lectured for, I think it seemed like 2 days, it was only probably a few hours, but I scribbled many, many pages about all the planets, and I try to remember them. And I'm getting better. Put it this way, I'm now conscious that they're there and a little bit of what they've done, so I have a larger universe. And that is, in a certain sense, the theme of this talk that I'm about to give, namely that the universe is larger than we might have thought if we didn't read certain books or listen to certain teachers. And the individual is larger than we might have thought if we just paid attention to contemporary Western culture. And so I guess you could say the point of the talk is, if we think about forgiveness in terms of a larger universe and a larger individual, the topic of forgiveness comes out very different than if we just sort of, I'll say, stick with or assume a smaller self and a smaller universe. So one of the things about Steiner that I think is really exciting and important is that he does many layers or levels of the self and many layers or levels of the universe, including many levels that I find it difficult to carry in a straight way, the way Brian does. But once we begin to take those levels seriously, even if we can't keep them all straight, it's really different when we start thinking about some of the bad things that we have to endure in the course of our life, that there are larger beings, really vast, mysterious beings, who have had similar pain and sacrifice and continue to do so. That's, I think, edifying and important. So we're not only not alone in relation to each other, that's the part of the individual that Steiner is expanding, but all the individuals together are not alone in relation to the cosmos, which is so fabulously vast and mysterious. So, I'm about, 2/3 finished a book called, that Irene referred to. It's called Unique, Not Alone, Steiner and Others. And the purpose of the book, and it's a little bit the purpose of the lecture, is to give Steiner his due, and at the same time to liberate him from enthusiastic followers who have him in a kind of a box. You might even say a weirdness box. In other words, a box where he's so vast and so amazing that nobody could compare. And if nobody could compare, then he looks not helpful, but weird. And so what I want to help us all to think is that Steiner is absolutely unique in the extent of his knowledge, and I even want to say the extent of his purity, that is to say, of his motives. I think he's a really sacrificial person in quite an amazing way. I don't know, unique in that category, that doesn't really make sense, but he's wonderfully pure in that. We don't have to apologize for him. He's a really great guru, except then you have to do the limousines and the women and the money and the whole thing. Steiner, you don't have to do that. He took the train through the night and the freezing cold, lectured to 10 people because he thought they needed it. So he's really a servant. Okay, now I've lost my thought. So he is really amazing in his knowledge and his purity, his relevance. He really plunged himself into the tasks of the time, which it turns out are continuing to be still our tasks. But he's not alone in that there are other great figures in the Western tradition, the Christian tradition, but also, in fact, those of us who live in the Bay Area are prepared to say even more so in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition, because we are blessed with these wonderful Indian and Asian and particularly Buddhist teachers. There are 80 Dharma Buddhist teaching centers in the Bay Area. Right. So we live in such richness that it's very hard, unless you're, you never leave the house. It'd be hard to think that all the great spiritual teachers are in one tradition, when it's so obvious that to almost everybody, certainly to me, that the Dalai Lama is the preeminent spiritual teacher on the globe today. Just beyond any doubt, he is our greatest treasure. In terms of a person who has shown the positive effect of spiritual work. Right? He doesn't just have spiritual thoughts. It's every day he forgives China. So then you just, when you're in his presence, you just go, okay. That's important. So I'd like to start following up on Brian's quite wonderful talk. Brian's talks are always wonderful. And a little bit on the individual that he spoke about, the physical. You really, if this is new to you, try to get this much. It's really helpful to have an idea of a human being as being physical, which we all know and love, unless you're one of those people who doesn't like your physical self. But you're certainly in a culture where you're supposed to. And so that's a good start. But then this etheric is the living part that makes the physical body alive and able to move. And one of the hierarchies that is the hierarchy that gives us movement. It's such a great thing to think of this, a spiritual being that out of its substance makes movement possible. It's a great thing. And then this astral is, astral in a certain sense is, we live in the physical, but we also live in the astral because we're interested in personality. We're interested in our motives and our, we're psychological. We're almost incurably psychological in our culture. Well, that's the astral. Brian called it the interior. That's a good way to think of it. It's personality, it's motives, it's the whole interior self, which in a certain sense our culture is busy denying, quite aggressively. Most of the social sciences are committed to the denial of interiority, which means that it's only the physical, maybe the etheric, right? But they wouldn't use that word. But then the astral is really important. So Jung is the great, brilliant interpreter, explainer of the interior of the psyche. All right, Freud gave us a good start, showed us that there is such a thing, at great cost to himself and very brilliantly and bravely, but a little bit exaggerated in a certain direction. But Jung then picked up that work and I think is a great teacher for our time with respect to the astral, to the soul level, to the psyche level, to the interior, my conscious, my unconscious in relationship and in relation to symbols and myths and a whole alive universe that is sort of getting our attention. Psst, pay attention. So that Jung's wonderful for that. But Steiner is, if not unique, he's certainly special with respect to the fourth term. These are called bodies, which is so unhelpful. It's dimensions or something else. The fourth term, which is the ego, but it's not the ego of Freud. It's higher, bigger, better than that. And it's really the I, or the self, the spirit, which Steiner says is that which goes on after life. This is what we really are. And that will organize another life after it spends a lot of time with discarnate beings, high beings, people we have loved and who have loved us, but also angels and archangels and bodhisattvas and etc. Brian used that term bodhisattva, and I'll try to remember to get back to it. So the I that I am is so much more multi-layered, connected, influenced, and influential than we might think if we just finish, Psych 101 at Ohio State. It's just that much more interesting than that. And the universe is so vast with these active hierarchies, active planets, which of course is something we also learned from Jung and the whole astrological world. So the universe now, it turns out, has these beings that are pouring meaning, capacities into the human, into the first off the planets, but then into the living Earth, Gaia. I think we should give up Earth. We should say Gaia, right? Living being, good thing. So in pouring into Gaia, its living quality and its nourishment. So we eat. That was very nice. Thank you. Especially the pie. It was really terrific, whoever brought that. And that's exciting for us to be connected to the earth through breathing, but also through eating and through space, through orientation. And those of you, I'm thinking of Monica there with those children who are then standing up and orienting themselves to the cosmos, right? Steiner's wonderful on the infant walking and then speaking, and then eventually this sense of who I am. Where am I? I love my little asides, but they are a little distracting for me. Okay, so we did the universe. We're talking about the hierarchies, we're talking about the earth, we're talking about the plant life, which is, of course, the etheric, the animal life, which is the astral, right? Because there's interior to the animal world. It's a big argument about whether the animals only have a group soul, which is what Steiner says, or whether the cat lovers are all going to win by arguing, oh, no, my cat has an individuality, and you've got Rupert Sheldrake on your side. And so that's a great argument. I think maybe Steiner eventually will probably lose it because nobody can control a passionate minority. Well, the animal lovers are the passionate minority in favor of the individual soul of their animal. And then there's also Jay Goodall and Barbara Smuts, who does the baboons. And they're just so overwhelmingly convincing that unless you're devoted to a particular anthroposophical dogma, which is a contradiction in terms, I want to emphasize, there should be no anthroposophical dogma. Steiner even said, it should never be said that as an anthroposophist I hold, or as anthroposophists we hold. That should never be said. That's such an important statement. You can say, and you could be influenced by, but not as a dogma. Okay. So anyway, back to the animals and having souls or not. He certainly says they have a group soul, and it's not a small thing to have a group soul for a species. You know, since there are millions of them, at least there are still millions of them, and there are far fewer than there were. Okay, and then we get to the human, which the whole universe is pouring, these hierarchies, and the universe is pouring into all these great strengths and capacities and longing. It was wonderful, Brian, longing. I think of aspiration, but it's the same longing. And longing is in many ways a better word because it covers our hard places, our hard times, right? But the longing is a great word for, in a certain sense, the beginning of autobiography. The first autobiography is Augustine's Confessions, and it starts with, Lord, I am restless. I could say I or we. We are restless. No, I. It's an autobiography. I am restless until I rest in thee, till I get home. I'm on this journey, I want to get home, right? But it's really hard because I'm here, and I'm in this body which I love, but it doesn't behave, and etc. So that's the beginning. It goes direct line from Augustine to Shakespeare to us. Okay, so the talk has a framework, which I'm already in, having to do with Steiner's, or the framework can be summarized by Steiner's summary statement about anthroposophy, written in 1924 at the end of his life, when he's already in that work shed where he spent the last 9 months next to the burnt slab where the amazing building had been. The beautiful wood Goetheanum went up in flames due to an arson, something to forgive. So he's in the woodshed, and he wrote not a definition, a characterization, he said. Anthroposophy could be characterized as a description. He says the path of knowledge, but when you get to know what he means by knowledge, it's really a path of thinking, feeling, and willing. That's what thinking is. It's the willing, which is active, will-filled, following right along what Brian was doing, and which is affective. It's not knowledge as a weapon. It's knowledge as an act of loving, which you see in a great teacher, all right, or someone who's just helping you through life. There's the knowledge that your lover, your child, your parent is giving you is a knowledge which is a gift. So that's the kind of knowledge that he's advocating. It's knowledge which is not something you do and then go and feel and will. It's knowledge which is willing and feeling in the very deed. Okay? So now we have kind of a context within which I want to talk about forgiveness. Namely that I accept as true that one very good spiritual path, which happens to be the one for which I am karmically intended, is the path, it's a practice, all right, which leads, doesn't say it does lead, it's intended to lead, it can help you go from the spiritual in the individual, spiritual in myself, the way in which I am related to the spirit world, to the spiritual in the universe, which is the way in which the universe is a manifestation of higher, deeper spirit life, which Brian was talking about. Right? But the lecture that Brian didn't give that I expected would have been how all the hierarchies have these 9 great gifts to the universe. Right? But just keep that in mind as a fact without the details. Okay, so it's a path for leading me, and it's this individual that he's leading, as I explained a few minutes ago, is multi, all right? Physical, etheric, astral, I, and the I, in a certain sense, is a double term. This ego is a double term. It's lower, which is the one where we all know about, and if you know about Buddhism, you know that that's the desiring I, okay? It's also in the Hindu tradition, the Bhagavad Gita, in the Upanishads. All of these great traditions have a lower I, the gimme, I want, I need, I. And then there's this other I, which is the archetype of the mother who gives herself to the child. The Dalai Lama says that all compassion begins with the nursing mother. Right? That's pretty good. He has a lot of good things. Okay, so now I want to go to I'll go to the Hindu tradition, and I mean you could start with the Vedas, and you could go to the Upanishads, and they're wonderful, but it's more likely that you would go to the Bhagavad Gita, which is a text that's vivid, it's dramatic, you know, because it starts with a battle. And we know about battles. It's in the news every single night. People are getting bombed and blown up from the ground and from the sky. So there they are. They're in a civil war. And there's a good side and a bad side. And we're reading about a guy who's on the good side. But he looks across and he sees, it's very much like the Iliad. He looks across and he sees the people whom he knows. It's a civil war. He sees his teachers. And he says, hell no, I won't go. This is a crazy idea. And we're all going to get killed. It's going to be like World War I, where the country that wins has the one person left. This is horrible. And Krishna, who looks like a charioteer, but in a certain sense that's the point of, not only the point of the lecture, but the point of anthroposophy, is that whatever you look at is actually deeper than what you see. So at first he thinks, he should have known better, but he thinks it's just a charioteer. But then the charioteer argues with him and says, don't be such a selfish little twerp. Your karma landed you here to be a warrior. And Arjuna says, I think I'll go off and be a monk, I'll meditate or something or other. And you think, get back here where you belong. And then that's chapter 2, 3, it goes to 18. And just by the way, Gandhi thinks it all happens there in the argument about action. But lots of other interpreters say, oh, no, you have to wait till you get to chapter 9, 10, and 11, when Krishna then shows himself to be the holder of the cosmos and of the gods. He holds all the gods in his being. And he reveals this to Arjuna. Okay, what does that have to do with forgiveness? Not so much. And so, which is not irrelevant, because you have to look for the various traditions and texts and teachers and what they bring. So they don't all bring everything. So in the Bhagavad Gita, you have this lifting of this guy on the firing line to the point where he is one with Krishna, and he is, in a certain sense, divinized in his consciousness. Right? But it's a little bit like the question that Brian asked, and all of us who were silent gave the right answer. And that is to say, the answer in accordance with our incarnation, namely that we want it. This is our game plan. Okay. So he then becomes one with Krishna. And when he goes back 5 times, Krishna says, therefore go and fight. When he goes back into fight, all right, it's not clear that the selves have survived. Krishna says to him, don't worry about the people you're going to kill. They're already dead. They've already been slain. It's all determined. Okay, so this great, holy, profound book has a limitation. It has the limitation of its time. It did not have a karma that was negotiable. It had a karma that was fixed. Some more 20th century Indian thinkers like Gandhi and Sri Aurobindo, about whom we had lots to say a couple of years ago, they say that karma is a law. It's true, it's real, it's important, but it is more negotiable than it was in the Bhagavad Gita because the evolutionary arc is really moving. And so the self is different from what the author of the Bhagavad Gita thought. So now we turn to one of the interpreters of the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita means song, the song of the Lord. One of the interpreters, important interpreter, is Gandhi. In fact, I've got a whole shelf of Bhagavad Gitas, and almost all of them follow Gandhi, even though there is absolutely no scholarly justification for it. Gandhi says there was no war. It's all about the higher self, lower self. It's a great interpretation. It's just not scholarly. It's helpful instead. They're not always the same. So Gandhi says there was no war. It's the higher self, lower self, and Krishna is the higher self of Arjuna. This higher and lower self is a critical element in forgiveness because all of the great teachers, in a certain sense, including the Bhagavad Gita, though it has a structure which doesn't permit this so well, all of the great teachers are talking about our having some experience of a higher self and a lower. The lower one is the one that Paul spoke about. What I know I should do, I don't do. But the higher self knows that. It watches my lower self do what I want to do according to the light of the higher self, and I'm not doing it. All right? Shakespeare. Okay, so where are we? Gita. We go to Gandhi, and Gandhi is saying it's the war of the higher self and the lower self, and then he says that by my higher self, I know that there's something good in every human being, and the goodness in that human being can come forward if I pay sufficient respect. If I forgive the offenses, whatever they are, including the British controlling India for 250 years and sucking the resources out and sending the products back to be sold at 4 times the price in India. We forgive that. Okay? We forgive them putting us in jail and et cetera, because there is something good there that is to be redeemed. Now, it's not so clear where Gandhi got that. He was influenced by Tolstoy, he was influenced by Ruskin, by a little bit by Thoreau. He was influenced by the New Testament big time. His mother was a Jain, which is, of course, completely nonviolent. So he's a very contemporary person. He's very much a synthesis of many important teachings. All right? And somehow, I would say, much more out of his experience than out of his reading or learning, he learned that the human being has a seed, a core, a flame, a something which can be touched by respect and by love is really what he's after. Sometimes he says respect, but he really is aiming at love. All right? And when we do this, he says, it's possible for us who are in opposing sides to come to a resolution. So he spent most of his life mediating. That's actually what he did. He went from one dirty, dusty village to another to mediate with mill owners and the panchayat, the 5 people who made the rules for the village, at some great disadvantage to some women or some untouchables or something or other. So he's a very, very great figure. He did not start great. In fact, he was a huge embarrassment in the beginning of his life, but he grew day in and day out by his experience. So he's the famous line, if you go online, you look at all the possible websites for forgiveness, everyone will quote the line from Gandhi, I'll get it right. The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. Seems like everybody interested in forgiveness has to quote that, for good reason. So I think in the case of Gandhi, his experience is I mean, he's really like an anthroposophist. His whole understanding comes from his experiments. His autobiography, he called it "My Experiments with Truth." Right? Not my definition of truth, not my examples of truth, my experiments. And some of his experiments were kind of wrong-headed, but some of them were great. And so we have here a person who learned from experience, from negotiating, that forgiveness is possible and it leads to something very, very positive. I think he doesn't actually have a metaphysics or a spiritual philosophy to support this. And one of the things I've noticed in getting ready for this lecture, something I've noticed before, to tell you the truth, that there are lots of really great insights that individuals hold and live by that do not seem to be supported by their worldview. It's a curious phenomenon. How do they get that way if they don't have this idea that you're supposed to get from, the New Testament or Steiner or somebody? Very interesting. Okay, I think it's the angel saying, "Psst, I got a great idea, listen to me." All right, so now we go to the Buddhist tradition. It's an even better example of experiencing, sort of outdistancing the theory. One of the key elements of basic Buddhist teaching, the Four Noble Truths, is there is no self. Anatta or anatman, no self. All right, this is crucial. Brian gave a very interesting comment that the Buddha may have been saying, wait a minute, you've gone too far into your incarnation. I mean, I've thought about that. And it could be true, and I don't know if it's true. Okay, it's a lot to claim. If it's true, it's very important. Certainly the Buddhists don't know about it. Okay, so that always makes me a little nervous. But it could be true. So now, the Buddha, of course, comes out of Hinduism, which is full of gods, full of karma, full of rebirth, full of a real I. The Atman is part of Brahman, etc., etc. And he just absolutely wipes it clean. No gods, no afterlife, no holy books, no divine teachers, nothing like that. It's like a spiritual psychology. That's how it starts. At the same time, he has the enlightenment experience, which leaves him totally different from the way he had been and from everybody else. So what's going on there? All right. So he doesn't say, therefore, I have been transformed by some whatever. He does not say that. But it could be that's actually what happened. So 5 centuries later, which just parenthetically, by the way, is the exact same time as the incarnation of Christ. I'm not doing cause and effect necessarily, but it's something to think about. A possible change in the psychic envelope, all right? And then those people, Nagarjuna and others, start saying, what happened to Gautama, even though he said he was just a guy who had a great experience and then showed himself and said, do thou likewise, and died, even though that's all he said, actually what happened was Buddha nature, Buddha, some eternal Buddha body, the Dharmakaya, the Dharma body, not just the Nirmanakaya body, the historical body, not just the etheric body, Sambhogakaya body, but there's a Dharma body, infinite and eternal body, which is the body of the Buddha. Not Gautama, who came and died and taught. No, came and taught and died and stopped teaching. There's also this Dharma Buddha who continues somehow, and of which we are a part. Remarkably analogous to the first, second, third generation Christians saying to the Jews there who prepared all this and who gave the bodies to all those people, Jesus and the mother and etc. They're saying, but you see, you were looking for a historical person. That's only Jesus. There's also the Christ. To which they're saying, some people said, yes, wow, I'm glad to be alive at this time to get in on it. And other people are saying, you're really going wacko. It's just, there's no reason for that. In fact, it's a heresy, and you should be punished. which is what Paul was doing when he was Saul. Okay. So there's an amazing thing that happens here where some people say what we thought was happening is only a small kind of relatively surface thing. Actually, it's much, much, much deeper than that when you get behind. And that is the difference between the original Buddhism called Theravada and Mahayana, the great teaching, the great vehicle. Now, it's all relevant for forgiveness because in the Theravada, where forgiveness, of course, is important, there isn't the ontological, there isn't the affirmation of a reality at which the forgiveness has an effect. See what I'm saying? There isn't a Buddha nature, and yet the forgiveness is honored. It's a curious thing. I'm going to keep doing this to you. I'm going to say we're looking to people who advocate forgiveness, and some of them have an explanation of how the forgiveness has an effect, either in another life or at some other higher level, or is made possible by a higher level. All right? And other people who don't see that at all. And all of them are working on forgiveness. It's kind of interesting and complicated and a little upsetting for those of us who think that ideas are really important. Because they are important, and yet there's some people whose experience seems to be outdistancing the ideas. In the case of the early Buddhist teaching. But now when we go to the Dalai Lama, he is in this Mahayana tradition big time, because the Tibetans kept all that, all right, and kind of really preserved very purely. And the Dalai Lama, of course, is not the first Dalai Lama, he's the 14th. So he's had 13 previous warm-up band lives to get ready to be the Dalai Lama for the whole of the world. Except China hasn't caught on. Actually, some Chinese have caught on, but the Chinese government hasn't caught on. Or maybe they have, and that's why they're unhappy. Okay. So he now has had all these lives getting ready to be the person who every day has to forgive the government and the soldiers that are torturing and destroying the very culture that is supposed to be one of the major, if not the major, vessels for the Buddha and Buddhist teaching and Buddhist experience. So the language is going, the monasteries aren't completely gone, but most of what's going on, so much of what's going on is going on in India and around the world. So it's a very hard time. So every day Dalai Lama goes back to Dharamsala. He has to comfort nuns and monks who have been tortured, been in jail for years and years and years. And that he has to be strong and be positive, and at the same time he has to be real about the extent of this and forgive. So he's constantly asked, just read a book, not a very good book, Victor Chan, the Dalai Lama on Forgiveness. It's all about Victor Chan. But it gives you some good quotations, which I was glad to get, where that people keep asking him, Dalai Lama, surely you're mad at the Chinese. Come on, fess up, And he says, I am not, he said, I am not, because Chinese and I are basically one. We are interdependent. So this is one of the key, probably the key teaching of the Buddhist worldview, because that's how the world came to be, not by a creator, but by co-arising, all right? And that's how we come to be. So we are codependent on each other. Ontologically, in terms of our actual being, we are codependent. So the Chinese and I really are. When I forgive the Chinese, I forgive myself, and vice versa. And it's no, Chinese are not forgiving the Tibetans. So the three terms that he has here: interdependence and emptiness and compassion. It turns out for him are really interchangeable terms. Now you might say, wait a minute, emptiness? What's so good about that? By emptiness, it's a hard word. Sometimes it's translated suchness. It isn't a good word, but it's empty of any particular thing that is limiting. So it could actually be translated infinitude. But he wouldn't like that because it would give the idea of a creator. When there isn't a creator, there's codependent arising. So emptiness is no particular thing to limit any other thing. And so once you get into that universe, each of us kind of flows into each other in a way that is real. So it's not imagining. We really are each other. The really good thing about this is that it doesn't have the Western aggression, arrogant self-importance. All right? That's really great. And lots of people in the West are attracted to Buddhism because it gets them out of this Western presumption of me, I'm important, etc. A slight disadvantage to it is it doesn't have it doesn't have as much of, or you might even say enough of, this idea that the I, the self, is a project. See, that one of the things that you get from Steiner is by leading the spiritual in yourself to the spiritual in the universe, you advance yourself as an I toward greater identity with the source of your I, which he calls Christ. But as a Buddhist, you could call it Buddha, or Buddha nature, or Buddha reality, or something. That is to say, that reality which is the source of my selfness as a mini perspective Buddha, which is what we're all supposed to be heading toward. It's actually Bodhisattva. So the Dalai Lama himself is a magnificent project over these 14 lives, but some of the language is so strongly emphatic about mutuality and interdependence that you might not get as much as you in your Western psyche need in terms of stimulating the transformation of the self. I hope you got that. I'm not, it's a little complicated. I'm going to leave it and then you can ask it. Okay, so I should keep going. So now I want to go over to the New Testament, which really has great forgiveness texts. I think until the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, the other great Buddhist teacher to whom we have easy access, though there are coming more now, Lama Surya Das and Pema Chodron and some really wonderful Buddhist teachers. Those two are fabulous at a kind of a ultra level. But until then, until really quite recently, I think it was true to say that Christianity is the only religion that has at its absolute core the theory and practice, I would even say command, to forgive. It's quite a good feature of that religion, which many of us have come to dislike for very good reasons. That part is really good. Right? It is about forgiveness. It doesn't mean that Christians are famous for forgiving. It does mean that, in fact, they, anyway, we won't do all that. It also has amazing treasures in it. You just have to look. So if you read the New Testament, and I have no idea if you have or if you do, if you will, but it's one of the great revelations in the whole of human history, beyond any doubt. There's a few lines here and there that you wish weren't there about who's going to be damned and whatever else. And you have to really work hard to get a better interpretation of them, which is possible but hard. But also amazing, amazing, amazing insights about human nature and human aspiration and longing that Brian was talking about, and also higher self and lower self, the great struggle that goes on practically on every page. And the ability of the primary person in the New Testament, there are now many testaments, all right, since 1947, but the four traditional ones until recently were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke all begin with the statement, the life and teachings of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And John is slightly different, and it's much more mystical and sort of et cetera, and Elaine Pagels thinks that John did not write the book of Revelation. That'll be interesting to have that discussion. Anyway, the author of the fourth one, according to Steiner, was this really high soul. Those of you who are taking this course either already know that, or you will learn that Steiner thinks that this John was, one of the really high souls with a fabulous relationship to Christ and to the mother and etc. But in any case, all of these four have in them important passages in which Jesus heals and forgives in the same act. Let us say the healing and the forgiving seem to be, if not identical, certainly codependent. And furthermore, Jesus says, when asked about how many times do I have to forgive, and he says, all the questions that come to Jesus are a little impertinent, actually. You don't even have to be Christian to think that. Here you're getting this really great soul with these questions, like these, sort of like this, right? Oh yeah, well, there's a great painting at the De Young right now. It's not Titian, but it's one of those, and there's of these really unsavory men bringing this the young woman who was caught in adultery. Of course, the guy was caught in adultery too, but who cares about that? So anyway, and Jesus says, "Who of you is without sin?" Okay, so there are these moments when you just kind of want to jump up and cheer and say, "Yes!" So it's got great social justice in it. I mean, it's kind of John Dominic Crossan's book is Jesus a Revolutionary? I mean, he's one of the two great scripture scholars of our time, Borg and Crossan. So this forgiveness is throughout, and when they say, how many times do I have to do this? He says, no, not 7, 70 times 7. In other words, unlimited for every lifetime. Get used to it. This is what it is to be live a spiritual life. To overcome your longing is to forgive, is really not a bad restatement of it. The unjust steward, and then there's the paralytic, and these are beautiful passages, and you really should treat yourself if you never have. Just read the healing and the forgiveness texts, and you will be very, very edified. And then, and I'll comment on this at the end as well, at the end there is Jesus having come in to Jerusalem for the first time. Well, until I went to Jerusalem, I don't think I actually took that in. That he'd never been there before. And when everything was going on was, up north. And then he comes into Jerusalem for the first, he says, I'm going to Jerusalem. And they say, don't do that, they'll kill you. And then he goes into one gate, and Pilate comes into the other gate at the same time with hundreds of soldiers. It's an amazing picture. These gates, these fabulous stone things. Okay, I'll talk about that a little bit. But anyway, so there he is. He's betrayed. He's carted off. He is whipped. He is put crowns on his head. He's given this impossible cross to carry. He is then nailed. I mean, just don't think about this. The nails being into the hands and feet. The other guys were tied. He was nailed. Okay, and he says to these two criminals who are hung at the same time in the same place. I mean, he says to the one, this day you'll be with me in paradise. But then he also says, Father, he always has this relationship to what Steiner calls the ground of being, all right, the sort of the ultimate source of the hierarchies that then like that. Well, the ultimate is this Abba. The problem with the gender language, which we're working on. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So this knowledge is very important in this whole business of understanding. It doesn't, Brian, it's such a nice thing with understanding. If we understand, if we stand under the reality, we can forgive. But it doesn't mean anything to forgive if we don't know what's going on. You have to know. You have to know what is the offense. And then you can understand the motive and the karma that that person is caught in. So there's a line from Thomas à Kempis, who I mostly don't like to read, in the 14th century, who said, if you would know everything, you could forgive everything. All right? So a parent doesn't have trouble with the child or the teacher, with the child who's misbehaving, when the parent or the teacher knows that the child has this problem. You know the problem. Therefore, it's easy. You could just forgive. You could just sympathize. You don't have to, it's no big deal. You understand. Right? So if we would understand but then that means understanding the karmic mysteries of all the people who are doing the killing. Okay, so Jesus, as I understand him, is a being who teaches forgiveness and who exemplifies forgiveness. And in terms of his relationship with Christ and the Father, we've got three levels here: Jesus the man, Christ this high being, and the Father who is sort of the ground of being. Okay? When you go those levels, then there is the opportunity to contemplate and be influenced by the large spiritual context within which our pain is emerging, and by which it could have meaning, which would then enable us to forgive, to bring about the pain and lift it to another level, which is a little bit like the guy's name was, the American soldiers named him Bill Cody, right? It's such a great name, in the George Ritchie. Well, Brian said we didn't compare notes, but we both, I sent him my notes, and he talked about George Ritchie, and I had George Ritchie right there in one of the major examples. Okay, so, it's a very complicated question. The ways in which Steiner is and is not Christian, anthroposophy is and is not a Christian, and etc., and it's a hard topic. But there's no question about Steiner being in relation to Christ. That is profound, it's definitive, it's comprehensive. All right? It doesn't exclude, from his point, it doesn't exclude Krishna, Buddha, shamanic, every other kind of good thing, but it is absolutely core. And the Christ living in Jesus of Nazareth for those 3 years is clearly a forgiving being. And Steiner is deep in that. So let me do a little bit with him now. Think about some things he had to forgive. And some of these are in the book that Brian and I both have in our head by Sergei Prokofieff, who is not the musician, but the grandson of the musician. Not the grandniece, nephew. He's the grandson. Yeah, grandson of the composer, and a very, very sort of spiritually, esoterically accomplished person. Also very controversial. Brian and I both have some regrets about his tendency to argue too much. But he is very, very deep, really, really deep. And he has a deep understanding, especially of Steiner's pain. I mean, I was interviewed in this film by Jonathan Stadol, The Challenge of Rudolf Steiner, which you should get. It's really very wonderful, all 3¼ hours of it. But I didn't know what I was going to say. I'm a friend of Jonathan, and I knew I was going to be interviewed. And then he said, something or other, and I started talking, and I found out what I said when I saw it. But a little bit like this lecture, so I'm probably not going to watch it. So I said, Steiner is a sacrificial being. Steiner was a suffering person. Some people think of him as being, an all-knower and someone too confident that he says only when he shouldn't say only, he should say perhaps, etc. But he is clearly a person who emptied his life in service to people whom he saw were in pain, which is, all of us in some way. Now, we might think, well, we're not in pain because, we're middle-class professional people, except that, most of us have really have in deep longing, in Brian's word. So Steiner was given the job. All right, he's an initiate. Initiate is a person who's given a job. So he's given a job to oppose materialistic thinking in the West. Well, it's the biggest job you can get. Western thinking has been materialistic since the 16th century, and a little bit more so each century, until we, in our culture, there are people in religion, but they're also materialists. So the materialism is so deep. I mean, it's like the water in which we're swimming. We can't even see it, how deep it is. All right? So that's a big job, but he couldn't really get very many people to get what he was saying. And he couldn't really get very many people to really see the task, which was to bring spiritual thinking to humanity and not just to each other. So it got a cultic dimension, which is always what happens with the great figure in the next level down. All right, so that's it. So he had that deep disappointment. So he then had to refound the society, which he didn't found in the first place in 1912-13, but in 1923. So he called all the active members and he refound, and this time he joined his own karma. So now we're thinking about a person who's had very big lives, very, very big, high lives, okay? And he presumably has a really big, high future, but he joins that karma, not his books, not his, his CDs and his effects, but his actual self to a society which is supposed to be representing spiritual thinking in the world. Big, okay? But in the meantime, almost everybody in the world knows about the Dalai Lama and Gandhi and Archbishop Tutu. I didn't even talk about.
No, I didn't.
The society has a small number of people doing an amazing amount of work. That's true. That's the positive statement. The negative statement is that it really needs to breathe a little more freely. All right, so Steiner had that disappointment. So I'm not making it up about the disappointment of the society. Steiner himself was disappointed. And he even said that the burning of the Goetheanum, the building that he designed so that people in the West who are materialistic could see spirit in matter, was then burned. And he said partly because the society wasn't really a bulwark, wasn't really a protection against adversarial beings. So I think Brian was really helpful to us there. These beings are themselves unhappy. I was just with Arthur Zients, who read a gorgeous poem about Ahriman's, trying to, sort of in dialogue with Ahriman, trying to get him to loosen up a little bit. It's quite wonderful. And he says, and then you will not be so unhappy. Lucifer, who we fear and love at the same time. We love because we're materialists, and we fear because Ahriman's taken over our head and making us more materialistic. Right, so we're like Augustine, right? A little split in half. So those two major adversarial, right? One who's saying everything's cool, don't worry about it. You don't have to pay taxes, you don't have to show up on time, you don't have to do safe sex, you can do whatever you want. And the other one's saying that is really nothing but matter anyway. All right, so Ahriman's pulling us down, and Lucifer's thinking very much like the Bay Area. We're all really spiritual because we read the Dalai Lama, we went on a meditation retreat, and so we don't really have to do anything particular. Okay, so those two are real. In the New Testament, they're real. The first thing that Jesus does when he starts his ministry, right, is he is tempted. It's the first, absolutely first event, his public ministry. He's eyeball to eyeball with Satan. Steiner says it's actually two beings, Lucifer and Ahriman, giving different temptations. All right, right there. And then his next move is to meet this woman who's been possessed. And he said, get out of her, and they go into the pigs. This is the next 3 years. This being of light taking on these two unhappy beings who are having their way. Give me those people. It's Mephistopheles. Give me Faust. And Faust is ambitious with a big ego and very selfish. All right? He says, I'll do it. I want that. Not only knowledge, I want experience. I don't know what you're going to do with Faust, but I hope it's all right, what I've done so far. That's the way I think about Faust. Who does, you do Faust? Yeah. All right. Anyway, it's too deep for me, but I know that much. Oh, I think I do. I could be wrong. I'm going to learn from Brian. I could be wrong about that. The tempters are real. It is possible, because we're materialistic and not too bright, to make every little thing, like losing your keys, the adversaries that did that. It's so crazy making. Oh, the adversaries, I got caught in traffic. The adversaries made me. Oh, give me a break. The adversaries have better things to do than you and your traffic, or your keys, or whatever else, or what. But they are real, and they throw human beings slightly off. Not so far off that we don't continue to long, and we don't even get a little bit so we feel like we're in on it. But they throw slightly off in the sense that we think we're loving when we're hating. We think we've got knowledge when we're just really in doubt. And mostly, for me, the big one is fear. I think fear is really where we live. I didn't know about fear until fairly late, middle of my life. And then I started to find out, oh, that's that fear thing again. Whoa, that's interesting. And when you get onto fear, you find it's everywhere. So interesting, right? So Steiner was not afraid. He was embattled, but he was not, to my mind, he was not afraid. He had huge battles, day and night, 18-hour days. Okay, so the Goetheanum burns, and he knew some people were trying to burn the Goetheanum. He did not say who did it. And he stayed there through the night, watching the flames take up the building. But the way I picture it, a major dimension of his inner life went up with it. Because we are joined in our work as parent to child to his ideas and to this sculpture, this architecture, which was the opportunity for the rest of us to see in this building shapes that could give us the quality of movement that the hierarchy would give if they did it themselves instead of through us. That's the way I think of it. Okay. All right, so he had these deep disappointments, and right up till the end of his life. And it does seem, if you read the people who really have meditated and sort of really tried to be in sync, in sympathy and empathy and compassion with Steiner, that he was a figure who was well acquainted with grief. He did have a lot to grieve. Okay. So, I'm going to do a little bit more on, this is disorganized, because I forgot Tutu. And I also wanted to go back to the George Ritchie, which is the second example of 7 examples in the Prokofieff book, The Occult Significance of the Bhagavad Gita. The first one... Occult Significance of Forgiveness. Well, I'm sorry. But I'm already thinking of the example. The Occult Significance of Forgiveness. The first example was Weissenthal, right, which I'm going to do now. And then I'll do Ritchie, and then I'll do Tutu. Okay. No, I'm going to do Ritchie first, because it goes from Weisenthal to Tutu very nicely. Because Tutu also wrote about Weisenthal. Okay. Let me pay attention. So, Brian already told you about this great figure, Ritchie. A phenomenon, I guess I would say. I don't know if he's a great figure, but he certainly has something for us to, makes us wonder. And he then is a doctor, and he goes to the, one of the camps, and everybody knows about this figure whom the American soldiers have named Wild Bill Cody. I don't know if that's so clever, but anyway, he was indefatigable and incurably positive, cheerful, trusted, loving, etc. And you heard how his 5 children and wife were just mowed down standing against the wall, and say that he was saved because he had these languages. Okay. Now, if you're reading the book, you could forget momentarily, I think, that especially if you're reading it by an anthroposophist such as Prokofieff, for that matter, Ritchie, that this is a Jewish man. He's not a Christian. He's a Jew. And his people are being exterminated by a large group of powerful people, many of whom are Christian. An embarrassing percentage of whom are Christian. Certainly, none of them were Jews. And the purpose of the Holocaust, of this final solution, was aimed at Jews, not people who happened to be in a country that some people wanted for their resources. Didn't have any actual important land resources. They didn't have any land because they weren't allowed to own land. Okay. So most of European history. So you could forget. Now what is going on? If you're reading a Christian or an anthroposophist, they will be saying that this man, Cody, this exquisite survivor for 6 long years, all right, and with absolutely perfect disposition and energy, all right, how then the Christian and the anthroposophist says, this is because he had the love of Christ in his heart and mind, all right. So now, if you want to say that, you have to get an interpretation of Christ, which is compatible and even acceptable to this exquisite Jewish man. Because you don't want to say that all the people are sort of Christian even though they don't know it. You don't want to say that. But Steiner and Prokofieff and some other people do want to say something which is right on the line and something to be worked with, all right? Namely that, not that he is Christian, but that Christ is a cosmic figure who the Christians had the blessing of having access to, but also, alas, to some extent, captured and used. Complex, running from serving to using. So we're really in deep here. How can we have access to Christ in a way that we're not in the wet cement of Christianity? But we don't want to be totally removed because that's the culture, just as Yahweh made the covenant with the Jewish people, which did not end at Christianity, the Christ being made a covenant with the people who came from his followers, all right, disciples, mother, etc. And it's also possible that the Christ has a covenant, as Steiner says, with the earth, which has nothing to do with, I shouldn't say nothing to do. I shouldn't say nothing to do, and I shouldn't say only, I shouldn't say those absolute words, but which is not controlled by Christianity. So the relation of Christ and the earth has to do with the earth. And in that respect, the Jewish tradition, actually, so far as I can tell, has a more creative, positive relationship to the earth than the Christian tradition. The undoing of religion in service of contemporary ecology is a much harder job in Christianity than in Judaism. Much, much harder. In Christianity, you got St. Francis and a few of his people. And then you go to Teilhard for 2,000 years. Okay, in the Jewish tradition, they never did get into that radical separation. So they may be more in touch with the Christ of the etheric Christ, the life-giving Christ in the earth, than the Christians who are very impressed by sin. Sin is important. But it could also be a little something that you could ride, all right, in a not so good way. Personal opinion, like everything I've said. This man, Cody, is, I just flashed through my mind the Tibetan in India who, it was a him, not a her, it was a him, set himself aflame in protest to the Chinese oppression. He did it in India because when you do it in Tibet, nobody finds out. See, Gandhi had that great advantage that the British news people were in India and flashed it back. But China controls the media, so nobody finds out. Okay, so these beings, these sacrificial beings, are everywhere. Native people and Chinese people. Chinese protesters who are going to be tortured. Just in Burma, they're just trying to get a little news release going. All right, it could flip right back, and they could all be tortured until death. They're everywhere. So if they are somehow related to Christ, you have to somehow, at least with respect to them, out of respect, liberate that from the Christian control. At the same time, and I think Steiner does it right, he sees in Christianity these amazingly high moments which are the result of that relationship with Christ through Jesus, through the New Testament, and through that spiritual stream. So that if you want to now talk about forgiveness in some upper level, you could talk anthroposophical language the way Brian did with a spirit self being the higher ego. You could speak in terms of the Christ in me is my higher ego, but you could also talk about my Buddha nature is my higher ego. And you could also talk about I am an Atman, and therefore higher than myself as a jiva, a little self who says to Krishna, this is a crazy war, we're getting out of here. So there is in each of these conflict moments the possibility for a higher or a lower self. And how we interpret them, I don't know better than you do, but I think we need to combine the two things that Steiner gives us quite wonderfully at the beginning of How to Know Higher Worlds, namely reverence for all the paths and all the teachers and all the texts and all the traditions, and humility, big humility. So it seems to me that this man, Cody, who was helping all the people, because in a certain sense, the people who were caring for the concentration camps were suffering too, because they could see in front of them the horrors of their own deeds, or deeds that they were forced to inflict. But of course, the others are suffering more. Anyway, he was available to everybody. So the Christians said, well, he's a very Christ-filled being, but he might not have been a Christ-filled being. He might have been a Abrahamic, Mosaic, Yahweh-filled being. It doesn't all have to be the same being. But we would like to know the relationship among them. Well, that's a lifetime of study. Okay, so now I want to go from there to a Christian, Tutu, but a Christian who is brilliantly, inspiringly global. All right, so he is a person whose karma landed him in a situation, right, as an Anglican priest. So he wanted to be a doctor and he wanted to be a lawyer and he couldn't get into law school, couldn't get into medical school. Now what am I supposed to do? He became a priest and of course one of the most truly important people in the world. So I'm glad his angel was blocking him from medical school and blocking him from, because I mean, Tutu is really important. Okay, so, and he then becomes an archbishop, all right, which is a big thing for a black man in South Africa, always on the line between his white church, not all of whom were nice, and his people, who are black Africans. Okay, so then the amazing thing happens, as we all know, independence, and Mandela, one of the great people on earth, comes out of, if you haven't seen Invictus, you have to see it, it's a requirement. Okay, he gets out of prison, 27 years, breaking rocks, and Mandela then appoints his friend, Tutu, to the commission called Commission for Reconciliation and Justice. Right? So hundreds of thousands of black Africans had directly experienced horrible cruelty at the hands of a very small number of very, very powerful, well-armed white people. And the task was, I wrote down the task, inquire concerning gross violations of human rights, hear and adjudicate applications of amnesty. There were also violations of blacks against whites, but the blacks didn't have a lot of power. They didn't have a lot of guns, didn't have a lot of money, and they knew they'd all get killed if they did something violent. But they did it anyway. Hear and adjudicate applications for amnesty and recommend reparations for victims. So it went around the country with Tutu as the chair, and they listened to people who had been tortured, mostly. If they were still alive, it was because they were tortured. They weren't killed, but many people were killed. And then they listened to the people who committed the crimes and who were asking to be forgiven. And then what happened, if you read this material, it's very, very amazing. What happened was this amazing purging of the person who committed these crimes, telling what they did in face of the person. It might be the child of, the wife of, but it might be the person. And then there would often be this amazing friendship or some deep of two higher selves. Their lower selves had just had this horrible experience, and their upper selves can join then in this great union, which then has had a great healing effect throughout the country. Lots of, I know some people from South Africa say, yeah, it's still going all right, so long as Mandela and Tutu live. Who knows how much healing they may have sent into that culture that it could actually survive. But it is one of the greatest cases of horrible oppression and an attempt, probably the greatest attempt in the history of all of human history, to have a widespread, informed, specific, not a bunch of white guys saying, we're sorry to the Native Americans, and we took their land, we took their resources, and we put them into the desert, and we mostly starved them and killed the buffalo so they had no food. We feel sorry about that. This was listening in grim detail to the horrible torture with the other, et cetera, et cetera. An amazing work. And so Tutu, on the basis of that now, and of course the Nobel Prize, which always helps, has been to many places around the world, right? To Northern Ireland, to Jerusalem, where he got in a lot of trouble, right? And he wrote in the book, may God forgive all people who have oppressed. And lots of unhappiness. You shouldn't have said that. You have no right to say that, etc. Which now brings me to the Weisenthal case. It's a very famous case and much discussed. There's a whole book of essays about it. Okay, so Weisenthal is a Jew. He's famous as the person who's trying to find out who did the killing. All right. He's a Jew, and it's the end of the war, and he's in a camp, and there's a 20-year-old German soldier who is clearly dying, and asks the nurse if she could find a Jew who would come and hear his confession, because he can't die without being forgiven. All right? So the nurse finds Wiesenthal, brings him, and Wiesenthal listens, and the man says, here's what I did. I was there. I saw this. We had a couple hundred Jewish people, mothers, fathers, children, in this sort of like a big garage. We set it aflame. As they jumped out, we shot them. Okay? And I was there doing this. Now I'm tormented. I can't die without forgiveness. You are a Jew. Would you please forgive me? Okay? And Wiesenthal listens, he thinks, and he leaves without speaking. Now, Prokofieff says he doesn't, it's as though the leaving is not an action. I think that's not quite right. There was really only one. He didn't forgive. It's really complicated. Tutu says, in a world in which we are truly all connected, we cannot not forgive. So one of his important books is called No Future Without Forgiveness. He said, with all due respect, I didn't have that difficult moment, but though another way he had much more difficult moments. He said, forgiveness is a necessity of our time. Now, Wiesenthal's argument was, no one person can forgive for another. All right, so I was not part of that, those people being burned and shot. So I can't forgive, and I can't forgive for the Jewish people. So, and Tutu, and I'm not settling this for you. I'm giving you this because you need this problem. All right? So welcome to the 21st century. Tutu says there is so much connectivity among us, even though different nations, different religions, different biographies, different whatever, and also between the past, the present, and the future. What happened in the past is still alive, profoundly alive, and has a future. And anything we can do to lift or to limit the pain of the past will help the present. So for Tutu, now he doesn't speak explicitly Christian language, but he is profoundly Christian. He's an archbishop. He's not a secular archbishop, he's a real archbishop. He is thinking in terms of spiritual beings. Certainly he's thinking in terms of God and Christ. All right? But he's not assuming he is not assuming any superiority with respect to being Christian. So one of the chapters, in fact, the name of the latest book is God is Not a Christian. All right? He's your guy. I mean, you're going to like him. I've now done this pretty elaborate study of Gandhi, King, Dalai Lama, Aung San Suu Kyi, Tutu. I'm telling you, you're going to like Tutu if you haven't read him. Okay, so Tutu says, very much like this kind of karma that Brian was talking about, there is no separation of person to person, nation to nation, and past, present, and future. So that's what happens when he goes to Jerusalem, and when he went to Ireland, and he went to Rwanda. 900,000 people were slaughtered in hand-to-hand, slaughtered with bayonets in Rwanda in the course of several years. So he goes to the widows and weeps. So I'm telling you, this is a man who feels what he's talking about. He's really and joyful. There's great videos of him and the Dalai Lama laughing together. And shame on South Africa for preventing the Dalai Lama from coming to Tutu's birthday because they were playing the China card. So sad. Okay. I'm going to end. I want to say a little bit about Good Friday, Holy Week, and Easter. I have no idea how many of you are Christian, but by parallel, so I was on the board of the San Francisco Zen Center, and the Buddhists are very fond of saying that Buddhism is not a religion. All right, so I was on the board, and whenever we had a meeting, we would start by a meditation. by chanting in Pali, Sanskrit, etc. And then we will prostrate in front of the Buddha, etc. I said, if I asked my Buddhist friends to do this at Grace Cathedral, they'd have me arrested for religious imperialism. Okay, so those of us who have grown up Christian, I still am a Christian, and I belong to Grace Cathedral Episcopal Church. It's right to be apologetic, all right, in the presence of anyone who's not Christian, because the Christian history is so tortured. However, it is also true that if, as I think, and Tutu thinks for sure, and Steiner thinks, and I hope you think, that there really are different true revelations, and that they come not just as knowledge, but as feeling and willing. That is to say, they include deeds and affect. They include love and warmth and feeling life. Then, if you have a chance, whatever your religious commitment is, to be in the presence of a community that has received a revelation of thinking, feeling, and willing, that is to say, of a true idea, all right, of one that is worthy of affect, of our affection and even love, and one that is a deed and leads to a deed, all right, then avail yourself, at least for the next 3 minutes. Okay, but really, to be participant in the deed is like going to the Kala Chakra with the Dalai Lama, or with these things which those of us from the West, do in a minute. All right, but then when you go to something sort of Christian, it gets controversial. All right, so I'm glad they've all come, and so that we can then have a genuine pluralism of respected traditions. And Christianity is one of those traditions, and the reenactment of the execution or crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The reenactment is a sacred ritual by any standard. So if you get a whole list of what would make a ritual sacred, this one definitely qualifies in terms of thinking, feeling, willing, and lots of other things too. Also, very often, great beauty, or especially if you go to Grace Cathedral where they sing. Okay, and where there's architecture and stained glass, and it just feels like, whew. All right, so, and there's a horrific element in this Christian history about the Jews having killed Jesus. And so, just quickly, but not because it's not important, this idea is pernicious. And it doesn't, the Jews don't need to be forgiven because it was not their deed. So if you look at the whole karma of the life, the mission, and the last week of Christ's life, it was a deliberate sacrifice. And there were players in the drama, one of whom was Judas, right? One of his 12. And it is to Judas that Jesus gives the first communion. He blesses the bread, right? And he dips it in the wine and he gives it to Judas. Says, what you would do quickly. He knows what Judas is going to do. And then John says, he went out and it was night. It was a dark moment when Judas's karma, whatever it was such that he had that deed. Now the Jews have this mixture of this amazing history of being chosen, of all the peoples to be chosen to have the covenant with Yahweh, the teacher of morality and history. But it also has this terrible disadvantage to be overwhelmed by the successor who married an emperor and then got very violent. So that's a hard thing to untangle. All right? So Jesus then tells his disciples, who are always the last to know, I'm going to Jerusalem, and they, oh, don't go there. And he says, oh, you don't really, I don't even have time to explain to you. And then he goes to Jerusalem knowing what's about to happen. He comes in, Pilate comes in with the soldiers, and the whole thing unfurls. So he's welcomed this coming Sunday, tomorrow, Palm Sunday, when Christians reenact the throwing of palm in the way of this Redeemer coming on a donkey. All right? And then one day after another, and then there's this supper, and we don't know for sure who was there. The traditional account has it all men. It's hard for me to believe the mother wasn't there, or Mary Magdalene, who was way ahead of the disciples. Lots of people fighting over Mary Magdalene, Christians and the feminists and the goddess people. It's really, whoa, books on Mary Magdalene keep coming. Okay, and she is really amazing. Okay, she's the one to whom the resurrected Christ appears. All right, okay, so there's the dinner, and Jesus said, this is my blood, this is my body. These are primal elements. There's blood, which sort of is the etheric of the body. Right? That's what's running the whole show in there, okay? And the bread, which comes out of the earth and nourishes us. And these then are given to the community. Okay. There's a big argument about what this means in terms of history. Emerson, who I love, says no ritual should be asked to carry that much weight. And other people say, no. When it's a God-man doing it, it can carry the weight. And other people say, well, God-man, no God-man, it's something, and that argument goes on, so you're now in on it if you weren't already. Okay. Then the next day is the crucifixion on Friday, and it's grotesque. And I don't know about you, but if you grew up Christian as I did, I always wanted to know, where was that creep Lazarus? He was dead. And Jesus raised him back to life, and he wasn't even there. It used to make me so mad. Okay. Steiner says, calm down, it's okay. When Lazarus was raised, in book 11 of John's Gospel, you don't see any more reference to Lazarus. After that, you see a reference to the one whom Jesus loved, the one whom he initiated, and who got the name. John is sort of a title name, like Mary and Dionysius. Got the name John. He was there. That was him. And Jesus then said, son, John, whom I raised to another level, initiate, behold your mother, who is already this fabulously spiritually elegant, pure person. You two then are this exquisite sort of team holding the deeper mystery of this revelation, which then, so then the Virgin has that history, and John has his history through the Gospel of John, and maybe through the Apocalypse. I don't know. I know what Steiner says, I know what Elaine Pagel says. Okay, so the forgiveness is, in a way, the last moment. When he's on the cross, he's dying. All right, and this has been grotesque. And he says, Father, Abba, who is in charge of the whole thing, including me, even though I'm right there because I'm one of the three beings. It's through him that nothing came to be that didn't come. Through him, nothing came to be that didn't come through him. It says in the beginning of John. Okay, so yeah, even though I am that Christ. Nevertheless, I'm also human, and I'm really, etc. And he says, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They have their karma, like Judas had his. This group of people, these Roman soldiers, but they weren't Jews, by the way, they were Roman soldiers. They have a karmically assigned task that they are performing. So karma is not iron necessity, but it is a major launch into our situation and what we have to deal with and what we have to undo. It seems that in addition to thinking, feeling, and willing, forgiveness is a kind of a fourth element as a way of joining the spiritual world with our sort of physical, historical world. I think so. Anyway, That's the end of the lecture, and I thank you for your wonderful attention. And Brian and I are now going to do something.
Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, my question is, when you mentioned before Christ started his work that he was tempted, wouldn't you say, being that he's an initiate, that that is one of the tests of the initiate, that is one of the factors, is to be tested?
Sure.
And that perhaps a similar thing happened with Steiner, with his vision of dematerializing the West, having the first Goethe on him, then burning down as his initiation to his task.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Since I was the one who mentioned it, I don't think of the Goetheanum as the first. It's huge, and it's, for him, it was horribly tragic, but not at all the first. I think his whole life, certainly starting in 1900, but maybe his entire life, had large and small challenges, tests, temptations, etc. Here's a temptation. He went to a monastery, a Benedictine monastery, where there were real monks who were really holy and praying, and he was impressed. And he said, I can see myself here. Well, that's a temptation. That was not his job. He was like Arjuna on the firing line. He could have said, this would really be nice. I like to pray, I like to chant, I can read all the books, I can translate and write a few. This would be a good thing. But he'd already done that. His job was much harder. It was to argue with scientists in Berlin and with his followers, which is even harder yet. So I think the temptations kept coming. Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, the other thing we know from Rudolf Steiner's biography, he fell deeply in love in his 20s. As a young man, he fell deeply in love with the sister of a school friend that he knew. And he spoke about her. He wrote about her on his deathbed when he was writing his autobiography. And he spoke with such tenderness. And he said, we recognized that we loved each other. But the love, we were both very reserved. Therefore, the love was not in the words, but between the words. And Rudolf Steiner, in a certain sense, you said, you could have pictured, if Rudolf Steiner had married this young German woman, that his whole destiny, he could have made that choice, and it would have taken him somewhere else. But he, in a certain sense, the fact that he remembered it on his deathbed, and he said, we're thinking of her, he says, we lived a short, we lived sunny days together. Then there was a brief correspondence followed by many years when my remembrance of that joy still lives in my heart with great longing. And in a certain sense, you feel that he thwarted his own will. Intentionally he thwarted himself, knowing that if he had married her, he would not have been able to become who he was going to become. So I think that Rudolf Steiner faced many temptations, and always, in a certain sense, was faithful to, as Robert said, incredibly faithful, incredibly pure to his.
But I was thinking the burning of the
We want to get more questions, Marianne.
Okay, just real quickly, though, the burning of the Goethe on him, just simply bringing him into a greater deed.
Huge,
that is what
tremendous.
I meant. That is what
it may have killed him.
Yeah,
A quick, those of you who might be interested, maybe you'd be interested in this. I'm fascinated by the women in the lives of these 4 or 5 or 6 major male spiritual teachers. Like Kasturba did not have an easy shot with Mohandas. Aurobindo's married to a young woman who died of tuberculosis before she even came to be with him. I mean, it just, and how you could just imagine the angels hovering over Rudolph and saying, "Don't do it! You've got a lot of work." Or maybe, I mean, from my point of view, that angel should have said, "This is going to be hard. You're going to need a really great woman with you."
Yeah.
So I'm not so sure where I am with that.
Well, the interesting thing was she died at the age of 35, and in a certain sense, you could say he did remain connected with her in the spirit, but the joy of living together on the earth was not something he participated in.
Right. And the line that sticks in my mind, tell me if I have this right, is it couldn't be.
Yes.
Isn't that a line that,
Yes.
that he wrote at that?
No.
He said, but I recognize that it couldn't be. I'm thinking, who thought that? You know what? Okay.
Yeah.
Good question, Marianne. Thank you.
So I have a question about these strong themes that we have through multiple different
Sorry,
modalities.
I can't, can anything, something, I'm having trouble hearing.
Okay.
I don't hear well.
The questions between karma and hell in the afterlife. I think that these are both ancient themes that reverberate in many different modalities, and I was wondering if you could shed some light on the metaphor of the hell eternal and karma.
Karma and hell.
Yes.
Oh, I thought you said health, and I'm
did
saying,
too.
I have no idea.
too.
Karma and health is a really interesting question.
Right.
Go ahead, Brian.
So you could say the experience that we have, I mean, what Christians call purgatory is actually what Rudolf Steiner and others in other traditions speak about as kamaloka. That basically, because we have desires and passions, and because we live in our astral body and we rejoice and satisfy our desires through the sense world, when we no longer have senses, when we die, our astral body, before it separates from us, our astral body still has the same yearnings and longings that it had while it was incarnated into a body, but it hasn't dissolved yet. The ego, so after we die, the etheric body remains intact for about 3.5 days, and we have a complete life review, and then the etheric body dissolves. The physical body is separated, the etheric body dissolves. Now the I has to deal with the astral body, with all its desires and passions, which still have longings. So we have burning thirst, but we can't drink because we have no mouth, there's no water. We have passions and longings. We want chocolate and caffeine and all the wonderful things, we want beauty. None of the senses are available to us. But the astral body, which has been living in the experiences, still has a longing for those experiences. So the purgatory or the kamaloka period is part of the experience. Is those desires gradually have to fade, and it takes a while for them to be purged. But gradually we do have to relinquish with them. But Rudolf Steiner says it's a very painful experience not to have a body and still to have the longing to be fulfilled. That's only one of the things that happens in Kamaloka.
But it would not, the dark strand of Christianity would say, therefore, you should deny the senses. Right. But he's saying the opposite, namely, engage the senses and purify them. And so then when you are finished with the senses, the rest of you will have the positive results of your healthy relationship to your sense life. So Steiner spent a lot of time working on the senses and giving exercises for us all to be able to hear, to speak, and to move in a way that is spiritually healthy, but not the denial, which for him is just an extreme perversion. And by the way, not Jewish, it's Greek. Even though the Greeks had this tremendous sense of cosmos, of order, they also, in this Gnostic Manichaean strand, had this deep distrust of the physical world. Yeah. So all these traditions have an up and a down.
They do, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well.
So humanity has a dark side, and each individual has a dark side. And how does us embracing our dark side relate to all of this and forgiveness? And basically that's the question.
It's too hard for me, Brian.
Well, I think embracing the dark side means that we recognize that what we have failed to do. And embracing it means that it's almost like in the story of Parzival, Kundry really embodies, in a certain sense, all of Parzival's failures, weaknesses, flaws, imperfections, and all the pain he's caused other people. She actually appears to him. And his job is actually to learn to love her, to learn to transform her so that she becomes radiant and beautiful. So embracing the dark side really means to recognize our imperfections and our flaws and to begin to work upon them, so that we can translate them into our higher self. Because when we purify the astral body, we actually are working, the ego working to purify the astral body, to embrace and transform the ugliness and the evil and the error, to transform that actually turns it into our true self. We then become beautiful, true, and good, through the transformation of ugliness, evil, and error. So embracing our dark side is actually our job, because we then transform that. Now we also have to transform the karma. We have to transform the effects we've had on life, and so that's where forgiveness comes into play. But we also have to transform the injury we've hurt other people with. But Rudolf Steiner says there's one level where we can forgive each other. The fact that people committed terrible tortures and murdered each other brutally, people can forgive, which is what Desmond Tutu is doing, and a beautiful job. People forgive each other. However, no two human beings can release the Mother Earth from the fact that human beings did such things in her presence, on her body. So the love that Christ has for the Mother, the relationship that this cosmic spirit has to the Mother, is to help the Mother help take on the karma of humanity, not to take on the responsibility for each human being transforming their own double, their own untransformed part. But no human being has the power to take on the fact that human beings have killed each other and brutally tortured each other. That karma belongs to the karma of the earth, and Christ also takes that on. And I really very much appreciate what Robert has said, and I think the problem that we have with the word Christ is that there is a religion called Christianity, which has nothing to do, or very little to do, with the actual spiritual reality of this being. And I think if we can recognize that who this being is, that the Christians claim to know, but unfortunately do a poor job. I mean, you see the bumper sticker, Christians are not perfect, only forgiven. Come on, give me a break. There are terrible things. I'm not saying that all Christians are evil either. They're not. But I think the misunderstanding of Christ in Christianity is even greater than it is in other belief systems, because the true nature of the Christ is love, forgiveness, life, self-consciousness, generosity, creativity. This is the true being, and I think that in fact, whether or not we recognize the name of that being, that any enlightened human being is in fact in communion with this cosmic spirit. He doesn't belong to the Christians. This is the universal human. That's what this being brings. He brings our humanity to every human being. Whether we know it or not, whether we call him by name or not, this is our universal humanity. So I think if we can begin to loosen our understanding of Christ and expand this understanding, we're actually doing the whole world a service. But maybe we need another name. That's why I often use the name Logos. It's less loaded, you know. It's profound, even more mysterious in a certain sense.
To complicate it further,
Complicated, yes.
I completely agree with what Brian said,
yes.
and I hold another position.
Yes, good.
That's not completely compatible with what I agree with. Namely that a high being, just like a great historical figure, a high spiritual being, just like a great, needs a community. They cannot just reveal in the air.
No.
They need actual, living, breathing, sinning followers. Yahweh needed the Jewish people, and they weren't always faithful. On the other hand, they were remarkably faithful, considering they couldn't see him, or it, whatever. They were faithful, they were not so faithful. In again, out again. We boober on this. It's wonderful. Okay. Yahweh needed that people. Buddha needed to go around to all the people who were meditating to show himself and say, why don't you try doing this way? Krishna needed to reveal to a group of people who recorded what he said. And Lao Tzu, fortunately he wrote the 81 verses just before he left town, and now we have the Lao Tzu. They need a community. He wrote it in Chinese, and the Chinese could understand it. So it doesn't seem, there's a moment where I think, Brian, we can go just a little too far when we say that Christ can be separated from Christianity. The Christian tradition, for better and definitely for worse, but both, has been a necessary recipient and developer of the grace that comes with that being. And it wouldn't have and couldn't have happened without. So however much we lament that history, I can only think that these really high beings had a pretty good idea of the best way to get the word out, even though the recipients were going to make a mess. There weren't any others who would have done a better job, or maybe there were, but we have this great romance about the Tibetans, but there's a great scene in which there are 3 Christian theologians, and Dalai Lama and Bob Thurman, another person, are in this conversation, and where the theologian is talking about the Tibetans and the Buddhists being so peaceful and so passive. Crazy. Okay. And so Thurman says to the Dalai Lama, Your Holiness, tell Professor Kaufman how when you were the 3rd Dalai Lama, you went into China with 1,000 troops and you kicked their ass. And the Dalai Lama roared, yeah, I did. All right, so they weren't all that peaceful and loving all the time. They're peaceful and loving, in the historical, depending on the need. So the Christians did, a lot of them were willing to get eaten by lions. There were amazing things that we've got. Francis and a few others. So, and the Virgin, which is, right up there, Kuan Yin and the Virgin are, these high feminine beings. So there needs to be a loop. And I think anything that breaks the loop is too much. At the same time, if the loop gets too restricted so that it's Christ and Christianity and it doesn't, then I think that's also really bad.
Yeah.
But our moment is, I think, to hold those two together. Right.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah.
Would you want some water, Brian?
I'm okay.
Are you a non-water drinking person?
Okay, thank you.
I want to thank you guys. My head is just about this, got about this much room left in taking.
That's good. We have that much energy left.
I'm just wondering, can you take what you've said and put it in the light of philosophy of freedom and the individuals in a moment?
Mr. Philosophy of Freedom.
Just to kind of like take it all and
We'll both do it.
send us off with some.
You do it, Brian. I'll be your echo.
Okay.
But you said you only had a little room left. This is going to take an hour or more.
No, we'll do it quickly. We'll do it quickly. In the light of the philosophy of freedom.
This is the new Brian.
Okay. So the basic picture is, we receive information from the world from 2 sources. We observe the world through our senses primarily, and we think about the world. So we observe the world and we're thinking about the world, and what we receive is the content of what we observe. The content of our perceiving we can call the percept, or the object that we observe, and the thinking brings to us an idea or a concept. And the truth of the matter is that these 2 things, the percept and the concept, appear to be separate from each other. And the question is, what right do I have to bring this idea to this object? Here's an object. I have a thought about it. What right do I have to put my thought into this object? Yeah. And didn't I just violate the object? To think anything. What right do I have? This object is complete as it appears to me. This is the Western point of view. This is everything. My thought about it is merely going to add something that has nothing really to do with the essence of the thing. But in fact, what we don't realize is that these 2 things are actually 2 sides of the same phenomena. So what I perceive of the object is one thing, but what I think about it is the other thing, and the 2 things together constitute reality. What I observe is only a bit, the material part that appears in form, but its idea is just as much a part of it. It just appears to me in 2 stages. First I observe it, and then I think it. So what happens in the result of these 2 things is I become aware that I am observing and I am thinking. And I develop a whole body of knowledge and experiences, my memories, my biography, my skills. I have mental pictures and feelings, and they all belong to me. My deeds, my actions, they all belong to me. So I become aware of all of this through the fact that I live in a polarized world But I become conscious of myself through somehow relating these two things to me. But ultimately, you could say, I tend to act out of the self that is limited to what I perceive and what I think. But if I can lift myself into a little larger picture, right above me, I could say, where do I really come from? I don't exist, I don't perceive my I. I do think my I, but there's nothing to perceive. The only perception I have of my I is the actions that I perform. So the question really comes, where did I arise in this mix? And then we begin to realize that I actually arose out of the same source that split the world into two parts. So I have a moral intuition. A moral intuition is the intuition of what I can do, of who I am. The beginning of moral intuition starts when I'm 3 years old, and I first recognize that I'm an I, and that I have the beginning of a biography. So I build up a biography, but all the time I think that I'm only operating in the sense world, and I think I'm only operating out of my feelings and desires and passions and mistakes that I make. But all the time I actually there's a higher self. The higher self actually is living up above me. And the higher self is radiating into me, giving me the potential at any time to begin to lift myself into a higher understanding where forgiveness and love and creativity begin to lie. So up in this realm is where moral imagination lies as well. So when Desmond Tutu had the idea of forgiving people, the idea of, well, was it Tutu or was it Mandela? When the idea arose, the question, so we have an idea. Let's get the victims and the perpetrators in the same room together and see if we can set up a dialogue. So that was an incredible idea, and then there needed to be imagination. Okay, so how could we possibly, okay, if we went around the country and we took the people, so that idea then was translated into an imagination, that then you could say the way it was actually delivered, the technique turned it into a deed and an action, and that deed had a healing effect. Instead of my stamping my desires into my actions, now this became something of a lifted imagination, lifting myself, overcoming myself, and lifting myself into a higher realm. I begin to participate with the whole of life. And that's where forgiveness and health can begin to live. Does that help? That's one way to look at it? Don't know if I did it for you or not.
That's what it was.
Okay. Thank you for the question. It's a lovely question.
Sure. Maybe I add.
Okay, please, Robert.
Oh, no, I'll take it.
Your turn. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Carol.
I love that you mentioned Mary Magdalene, and in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, she talks about, in one of the translations that I have, the root, and that we need to be in touch with the root. And also there's this part about, this conflict between Peter and her, the discrediting of her. And I wondered if how you see, either of you see, in terms of her, Mary Magdalene theologian, how does that connect with compassion?
I have a lot to say, but I don't know if
I'd love to hear anything about it.
If it'd be on the question. Okay, so how do I think about Mary Magdalene? Let me start with that.
Yes.
So I think that let's think about Christ has been executed. Then is the day when he is fighting sort of the negative forces in the spiritual world, the middle day. Then there's the Sunday morning, and I never could picture what it means that the stone is rolled back. But then when I went to Jerusalem, they had these enormous concrete stones that you couldn't ever lift, but you roll them, and inside there's a cave with a lot of bones. And that's the burial. There might be another sort of casket in there, but anyway, eventually it's all bones, and that's where the bodies are placed. So when she went to anoint the body, it wasn't there. So of course the idea is somebody has stolen the body, even though there were supposed to be guards there. So what's happening? And then this being, which I take to be an etheric right? A ghost-like figure, which is both somewhat physical, but also somewhat able to go through walls and relocate, whatever else, like a ghost, all right? That figure then is off to the side as a sort of looking like a gardener, okay? And she turns and she says, they've taken my master, okay? And then he says, Mary, which I take to be a title. You know, you're already an accomplished, spiritually accomplished person. Look again. And she looks and she goes, Master. All right. Now, I'm assuming if Peter had been there, he would have said, what are you talking about? Because he would not have seen, but she did. All right. So for me, Mary Magdalene, like the mother of Jesus, are two of the unquestionably highest beings in the New Testament. Because she was given the opportunity by the resurrected Christ to see him in his etheric body. They couldn't do that. Eventually they could, but they couldn't do it then. So clearly she is a person initiated in some way by him to be an example of what it's like to be his close disciple, follower, and helper. So it's those, the Marys, whenever if you want to jump a level, jump up to the Marys there. And John comes next, and et cetera, down the line. So our time is up.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful moment to say thank you to Brian and to Robert. If I may take a few seconds more, I would like also to acknowledge the two ladies sitting over there who helped us to have such a wonderful snack and organize this event. So, and particularly, I would mention Marley, because Marley, that's her last day to work with us.
Whoa!
She has organized so many events together with me that I want to tell her thank you with flowers and some thoughts.
Ah,
Yeah.
wonderful. A CIIS alum, by the way.
Yes. Wonderful.
And that's all your meditation.
Oh.
Please, Kavi, could you stand up that we can...